Okay, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Let's see who's here. So Cindy's here. Good morning, Cindy. Lily's here. Good morning, Lily. Not good morning, Ella. Good evening, Ella. Casey, hello again. Good morning. Michael's here. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Carmen and Karen and Mashid. Good morning to all of you. Hope everyone's doing okay. For those of you who are in Vancouver, you'll see it's nice and beautiful and sunny outside. So I think we should just cancel class and we should all just go outside and enjoy the sun. Don't do that. I wish we could. Hello, Min. Hello, Jenna. When I was in junior high, when I was in grade 7 or 8, I had a teacher who he taught us health class, and so in health you kind of learn about nutrition and exercise and how to take care of yourself and stuff like that. And he always, on days like this, he always would say that he thought it was better for us to be healthy than to talk about health. So we would all just go outside and play baseball for an hour. And so, yeah, he was cool. He was a cool teacher. um, okay, so who else is here? We've only got 7 people. Okay, so what are we gonna do today? Today, we may finish off with India today. There may be a little bit to just tie up tomorrow, but we'll just see how it goes. Which I'm kind of finding sad. I'm kind of enjoying this unit. I'm kind of enjoying learning about India. I think it's super interesting. I kind of wish we could spend a little more time on it, but there's a lot left to do, and so we'll have to move on. But I'm enjoying it. I hope you're finding it interesting too. I don't know if you are. Good morning, Chiffon. I'm not sure if you're finding it interesting, but I certainly am. Let me see. Okay, so let's jump in here. Okay. So yesterday, you'll remember we were briefly introduced to this guy here, Chandragupta Maurya, and he is the founder of an empire in India, a Mauryan empire. It becomes one of the largest empires on the Indian subcontinent, and in a way, it's kind of important because it is a early kind of forerunner of modern India, and so the Mauryan Empire covers a similar territory to the modern state of India today. Good morning, Sabrina. Whoops. So you'll see he's in power here for maybe about 25 years. Good morning, Thika. Oops, I keep doing that. He's in power for about 20 or 25 years or so. And he is spoken of far and wide. And so he becomes famous within India, but of course he has contact with the Greeks as well, which we'll talk about very shortly, and so they know of him as well. That's okay, Eliana. In his later life, and we kind of skipped over this part of the video yesterday because it was, we had to move along. But he apparently becomes a Jain monk, a Jain ascetic at the end of his life. We learned, good morning, Adalbert. We learned that he may have come from a Kshatriya or a Vaishya clan originally. We know that he spent some time in the Northwest. He may have encountered Alexander the Great, who was there conquering places, and sort of came to an end when his conquering came to an end when he encountered India, and his generals decided that was enough. And again, he creates this empire, which is a forerunner of modern India, and he kind of ends conflicts with the Greeks, with the Seleucids, when he signs a peace treaty with General Seleucus, right? We spent a little more time yesterday talking about his grandson Ashoka, And so he's an Indian emperor. He's the king of this Mauryan empire that his grandfather created. And you can see he's a he's emperor for about 40 years, so he's in control of this empire for quite some time. Good morning, Lim. Um, he's in charge of quite some time, and again, his empire also covers most of what is modern India today. Um, we said that he's kind of an interesting historical character because he, partway through his career, he renounces violence. Um, at this point in history, often the way that people are brought under control is through violence or through threats of violence, anyway. But we hear the story of Ashoka while he's um, ending a battle with the people of Kalinga, which his group wins. He becomes incredibly kind of disturbed about the death and destruction that follows war, and so he kind of looks to Buddhist and Jain teachings, and he decides that he's not going to rule his empire by force. He's not going to rule his empire through violence. He's going to rule it according to Dharma, according to universal principles and universal laws, which is pretty interesting and doesn't happen very often in world history. And even more interesting, it seems to work for him. So we said that he kind of tries to present himself as the father figure to a nation. And so he presents himself as a father looking out for his children being the people of India. And he goes about sort of creating officials to tour the realm, to tour the empire, and attend to the welfare and happiness of all, which again is quite something, because normally you send out governors to make sure that people follow the rules, and when they don't, you punish them. But here he seems to be sending out people to make sure the people of the empire are happy, which again is quite something and quite different than what you see in many other empires. We see that in addition to non-violence, he adopts a principle of non-injury to all beings, human and otherwise. And so he's got certain rules for the treatment of animals and how animals can be slaughtered and eaten, and which ones can be slaughtered and eaten. We've got requirements for medical treatment for animals and for humans. And he kind of stops hunting as well. He stops sort of killing for sport, which is often a favored sport for kings and emperors. They tend to demonstrate how sort of brave and powerful they are by going off and hunting dangerous animals like tigers and things like that. Very briefly yesterday we talked about the Jain religion. I said we didn't have a lot of time to spend on it, unfortunately, but it does have some fairly strong connections with the Vedic Brahmanism and the Buddhism that is the faith that are also kind of circulating through India at this time. And so the Jains believe very strongly in non-violence and in non-attachment, which is similar to the Buddhists. And they also have a belief in asceticism. And so the sort of denial of comforts and pleasures for the body so that the mind can be kind of released from these things. We said very quickly there were 5 main vows of nonviolence and truth and not stealing and things like that. And we also said that similar to the Hindus and similar to the Buddhists, the Jains believed in reincarnation, in transmigration. And so I wanted to point out that this is a very interesting difference between the Eastern religions and Western religions, right? Where you have Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and basically the journey of the soul is linear. It kind of goes from here to here, right? So you're born, you live your life, you die, and then depending on who you talk to, if you're good, you get to go to heaven. If you're bad, you go somewhere else. Sometimes there's a middle level, depending on who you talk to. Um, but your life's journey, the journey of your soul, is linear, right? You're born, you die, and then you go to some sort of afterlife, and then that's the end, right? But in these Eastern religions, there is a cycle of death and rebirth and reincarnation and transmigration, right? You're continually born, and so people in the East here, people in the Indian subcontinent, believe in this cyclical path of the soul, and they are concerned with how to get out of that cycle. Sorry, there's a big dog outside. Um, they're trying to figure out how to get out of that cycle, whereas the Western religions are trying to figure out how to get to heaven, right? So there's kind of a different conception of the sort of path of the soul and where souls go. Are they locked in a cycle until they're able to free themselves, or is it a linear path where they're trying to end their journey in the right place, right? So these are very different ideas about how the path of souls, if you will. The other thing that's really interesting about Jainism and about Buddhism as well is that they are what they call transtheistic. And so we've talked about monotheism. Well, we haven't spent much time with monotheism, but monotheism, mono is one, so one God. Polytheism, we've talked about, where you have many gods. But the Jains and the Buddhists are imagining the universe in a transtheistic way. And so the idea is that they're believing in something beyond gods. And so they feel that the universe has an order, the universe kind of works in a certain way. And gods may exist, but gods have to follow the laws of the universe anyway. And so people, the Buddhists and the Jains, are not looking to gods to control the universe for them and deliver them. They are trying to align themselves with Dharma, with the order of the universe, whether gods exist or not. And so it's trans is beyond, right? So they're thinking not of monotheism or polytheism, they're thinking transtheism. They're thinking of something beyond gods, something above gods, which again is really interesting as well. Who's here? Manish is here. You are late by a few, but I'm glad you're here, Manish. Yeah, so the Jains are thinking about transmigration, they're thinking about reincarnation, and they feel that the soul can be liberated by following these three jewels, right? Correct view, correct knowledge, and correct conduct. And sometimes there's correct asceticism put in there as well. So there's, depending on who you ask, sometimes there's 3 jewels and sometimes there's 4. But following these is what will lead to liberation. That's what allows you to get out of that cycle of reincarnation and sort of liberate your soul. Okay. All right. And then we talked about, I asked you to watch a section of that video, the story of India. And I asked you a few questions, which I think, if I remember correctly, we need to talk about. So I'll ask you this first question. How did historians learn of the existence of Ashoka? So the narrator in the documentary there, Michael Wood, he took us to, I'm not sure if it was a university or a museum, but he took us somewhere and he explained to us how historians learned about the existence of Ashoka and what he did. And so how did they learn about that? How did they learn about that? did they learn about the existence of Ashoka? Okay, so Aliana says they learned it through his own writing. Well, they definitely heard it. They definitely heard about it through writing. I'm not sure if it was necessarily Ashoka's, but it was through writing. That's right. Casey says written documents. Documents is probably not the right word, but writing is definitely the right word. And Karen says a Rosetta Stone, and so you'll hear people talk about Rosetta Stones quite frequently. And if you'll remember from when we talked about Egypt, that's how we figured out how to read ancient Egyptian. Right, there was a stone, a big piece of stone with inscriptions on it, found at Rosetta in Egypt, and based on the writing, they were able to translate hieroglyphic and Demotic, right, from ancient Greek. And so a Rosetta Stone is usually, it's almost kind of a cliche sort of statement about, the key to understanding something, and so in India here we have this key to understanding this Brahmanic script, and it tells us about Ashoka, right? Someone who was kind of lost to history until the 1800s, and we start to learn about him again through these inscriptions and writing. And hello, Jimmy, and hello, Sarvish. I'm glad you're here. So again, I'm gonna hammer home the idea of writing for ancient civilizations. Think about the Indus River Valley civilization that we talked about at the beginning of this unit, where we saw some pictures of their cities, and we saw some stamps with cows on them and things like that. But that's kind of, we don't really know much because we can't read their writing. And so writing is really the key. And when we're able to read people's writing, it opens up a whole different world of knowledge. It really allows us to learn about what people thought and said and believed. And so sort of cracking the code and learning to read these ancient scripts is so important. And of course, it happens here with, what's his name? I want to say Will Peary, but that's a math teacher at the college. I've got his name in another slide. I'll remember it in a second. He's the one who figures out this Brahmanic script, and he starts to be able to read it, and then we get to learn all about Ashoka. So I've kind of answered this question already, but let's just do it anyway. How does he come to his idea of nonviolence? How does he come to that? How does he come to that idea, and what does nonviolence mean in terms of ruling the people? How does he come to his idea of nonviolence, and what does that mean in terms of being a king or being an emperor? How does he come to his idea of nonviolence? Okay, so Casey says based on Buddhism. So that's probably true, Casey. So he seems to have had some sort of knowledge of Buddhism. We're not quite sure if he was if he just knew about it, or if he was kind of a half Buddhist kind of thing. We don't really know how strong his beliefs were. but he was probably at least aware of Buddhism, and so that may have inspired him to take on this approach of nonviolence. Karen says, after fighting a war and seeing how people suffered. Yeah. So, hey, Sam. Um, yeah, so I think those are the two parts of the answer there is that um, he did fight a war with the people of Kalinga. He saw, all of this death and suffering and misery that follows war, particularly if you lose the war, but even if you win it. And so he may have been inspired by Buddhism and Jainism to renounce violence, to try to find another way, find another way to be a leader, right? Find another way to rule the people. And that's kind of what he does, right? So he goes to the Bodhi tree. So he goes to the same tree where Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, where he sat beneath that tree and meditated for about a month and became enlightened, right? When he figured out the Four Noble Truths. And so Ashoka goes to the same place and sits there and meditates and tries to think about how to govern his empire. And so what kind of ideas come to him? What kind of things does he think about and discover when he's in that place meditating where the Buddha did? What kinds of ideas come to Ashoka? What kind of ideas come to Ashoka? There's a bunch of things. The documentary says a bunch of things. What do they say? What kind of things come to him? He sits beneath the tree, he meditates, he talks to the people around him. Well, I don't know if he becomes enlightened necessarily. To become enlightened, at least as far as I understand it, is to free yourself from attachment and desire, and in doing so, you free yourself from this cycle of death and rebirth and death and rebirth. And I don't know that happens to Ashoka. He has a bit of an epiphany. He has a bit of a discovery about how he wants to live his life and rule his empire. But he doesn't necessarily become enlightened. At least I don't think so. No problem, Pearly. Hello. So what do you think? Why? What kind of things does he come up with? What kind of things does he come up with? I think the documentary, if you recall it, he talks about, they mention citizenship, right? So how do we behave in a society, right? How do we behave in a way that allows us to live in harmony with others, right? So he's kind of thinking about that. He's talking to other people in the community, trying to get an idea of what people's values are and what it means to live together, right? Definitely he develops more ideas on nonviolence, right? And so we'll come back to that in a second. I think that's a tricky question, but we'll come back to it in just a minute. Um, at one point in the video, you'll remember they go to that animal hospital, right? So we see some monkeys and we see a camel named Raja, and the woman who was running this animal hospital was um, talking about kindness to animals, which was something that Ashoka was concerned about, which is kind of interesting because most emperors are not super concerned with the welfare of animals, but Ashoka is. And why was he so concerned about the correct and appropriate treatment of animals? And actually, it's the same reason. It's one of the reasons why we should be concerned about the proper treatment of animals as well. But why was that? Why was that important to Ashoka? Oh, and sorry, Pearly, I missed your rejection of violence. That's important. That's one of the things that he that's one of the things he came up with as he was sitting beneath the tree. So that's good. Um, okay, why is it important to be kind to animals? What does he say? So Pearly says, yeah, if you are cruel to animals, you will be cruel to humans as well. Yeah. So Ashoka is saying, and the director of the hospital is saying that animals in many cases can't defend themselves unless it's a tiger or something, but animals can't defend themselves, and so the way that you treat animals says a lot about who you are, right? And that's the way that you'll treat people as well. And so Ashoka, I don't think they said that, but that actually might be part of it. The idea that a soul is a soul, and so if you're mistreating a living thing, then it doesn't really so much matter if it's a human or an animal. Yeah, they say that's exactly true. Interacting with animals shows people's true self, right? So Ashoka is interested in people treating each other well, and so he's also interested in treating animals well, and that might be part of it too, Karen. I'm just not positive. And so finally, we get to the end of that documentary, and they're talking about these edicts of Ashoka. And so an edict is kind of a proclamation. It's a thing that the king says to everyone about how things are going to be, right? So they kind of a king or an emperor will say how things are going to be. And in terms of Ashoka, he inscribes these on stone in a number of places around India. But there's a bunch of key ideas that are in those edicts, that are in those writings. And what are some of them? And again, some of them might be a little bit repetitive here, but that's okay. That's okay. Yeah, to spread Dharma, or the understanding that the world is governed by Dharma, right? Dharma is the universal law, the way that the universe works. And Ashoka says, I'm going to run this empire according to the Dharma. I'm going to run this empire according to universal law, according to the beliefs and values that we all share, right? So that's part of it, right? He says that we're going to rule by virtue and by universal law. We're not going to rule by violence, right? Pearly says, yeah, there's ideas about world peace in there, which is, wow, that's early for that to come up, right? World peace and religious tolerance. India in this period is already a multi-religious society, right? There are Jains running around, there are Buddhists running around, There are Vedic Brahmanists running around. And so it's already a religiously plural society. And rather than try to enforce one religion on everyone, Ashoka says we're going to have religious tolerance, right? The first physical evidence of the Buddhist faith. I don't know. Maybe? I don't remember. I don't remember, KC, if the video said that or not. That may be true. I don't know for sure if it is or not. If it is, then good for you. If it's not true, I'm not sure. So, but certainly, I think you would be right in saying that there are aspects of Buddhism kind of woven into Ashoka's edicts and woven into the things that he says. And so you would definitely be right in saying that. Whether that's true or not, I don't know for sure, to be honest. Again, in India and Buddhism are not my strong point, but they might be because I'm inspired to learn more. Okay, so in these edicts of Ashoka, we've got Dharma in there. We're going to rule according to Dharma. We've got ideas about world peace. We've got ideas about religious tolerance. We've got elements of the Buddhist faith kind of woven in there, and elements of the Jain faith as well, and probably even elements of Vedic Brahmanism. And so he's kind of been able to take some beliefs and values from all these different people and kind of weave them into an approach to how to govern his territory, which is really interesting. And again, really interesting because, we're looking at over 2,000 years ago, right? So so it's James Prinsep. Why was I thinking Will Peary? Those two names are nothing like each other. Okay. Who knows what I was thinking. So we said, of course, Ashoka had almost been forgotten, but in the 19th century, in the 1800s, this English researcher James Prinsep figures out how to read this Brahmani script, right? And so he has some, in the video we see he has some ideas about how these symbols might work, how they might encode meaning. Turns out he's right, and he manages to figure out how to read this stuff. And so all of a sudden we are able to enter this world of Ashoka and who Ashoka is, what he does, and what he believes, right? And this is the stone here. And you can see some of this Brahmani script written down, and this is what James Prinsep starts to figure out how to read. We said, of course, following this attack on Kalinga, Ashoka is mortified by the death and suffering that occurs, right? And they say in the video, war is a tragedy for everyone. And so he decides to bring Buddhist principles and Jain principles into his governing of the empire, right? He wants to govern from a place of non-violence. And so again, he decides that all humans share the same values, not value, but values. And he's going to rule by persuasion alone, right? So he's not going to use force. He's not going to use violence. He's going to try and convince people that the way he wants to do things are for the good of all, right? And so, again, he goes to the place where the Buddha meditated, where the Buddha became enlightened, and he comes to understand a number of things, right? He thinks about good conduct and how to be a good governor and how to be a good citizen. He thinks about animal rights, and like Pearlie mentioned, how you treat animals is how you treat people, right? It says a lot about who you are, because animals can't fight back. He thinks about a political order for his empire based on nonviolence, religious tolerance, which we mentioned, and again, the documentary kind of phrases it as an empire of the spirit, which sounds very romantic and exciting. in his edicts, he says a number of things, right? He says that all people are one family, right? So he, regardless of sort of ethnicity or varna or caste or religion, he says that we're all one family, we're all one people. Um, and again, what's really interesting about this is that just like when we talked about the Buddha, his approach doesn't come from God, right? His um, one of the things we talked about with the characteristics of religion is that it helps to justify a ruler's power, right? I am the ruler because the god says so. But that's not what Ashoka is saying, right? Ashoka is saying that, I am the ruler, and, we can all live together based on basic values of goodness. And so God doesn't come into this. God isn't a part of his edict. And again, which is really interesting. And it's a very Buddhist idea as well, because for the Buddha, his knowledge doesn't come from God, right? God doesn't reveal something to the Buddha. He figures it out on his own, right? So um, there's a even though Buddhism and Jainism are kind of spiritual religious practices, they are are kind of secular in a way, right? They're not about gods. They're about people and how should people live together. And so we can see that in the way that Ashoka chooses to run his empire, right? Based not on God, not on power, not on force, but on personal morality, right? And so the same ideas that we use to go about our lives and be good people can also be used to run a state, to run a country. Yeah, so Ashoka erects these edicts, these stone writings, all around India, and so you can see them here um, on this map here, and there's quite a few of them, and they're spread all throughout Ashoka's empire, explaining how the empire is to be run, right, and what the principles are that determine how this place works. Yeah, and here's one of them here, right, and so you can see this huge stone column and all of this Brahmani script written down, explaining to the people who Ashoka is and how this empire is to be run, right? What the values and beliefs of this empire are. The last thing I think we talked about the other day was the decline of the Mauryan Empire. And again, we're not entirely sure why this empire declines. And so sometimes, again, historians like to divide up the history of countries and regions into certain periods of economic and political centralization, so where one king or one group has control. And then there are periods where the king loses control, things become more decentralized, different groups of people have power, things are a little more chaotic and disorganized. And so that's what happens with Chandragupta Maurya, his son, whose name I can't remember, and his grandson Ashoka. We have this period of India where India is kind of economically and politically controlled by one king, and then we kind of enter into a period where things become a little more chaotic, a little more confusing. But again, we're not really sure why this is, and often because when centralized control starts to disappear, so does centralized record keeping. And so we're not entirely sure what's going on, but one of the things that people do suggest is that this empire was very reliant on Ashoka, right? Because he wasn't keeping things organized according to force and punishment. He was keeping people organized by portraying himself as a father, right? The father of a nation. And so obviously people liked him and believed in him, and so they did what he said because it was him, right? But after he dies, his successor has to try to do the same thing. And if they're not able to, if those kings are not as inspiring, or if they're weak, or if they make a lot of mistakes, then people aren't going to follow what they say anymore, right? And so centralized control can sort of collapse. And it seems like that may have happened here. Um, the Ashoka's empire was held together by good feelings for Ashoka, but when Ashoka's gone, um, people may not follow the replacement king, right? Oh yeah, and we saw this too. We saw in the documentary the other day that one of the things that has come to us from this period, not just not just Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and a caste system that comes out of this period, but the other thing that comes out of this period is Ashoka's wheel of law. And as you saw in the documentary, India chose to put that wheel on their state flag when they become a country in 1949, I think 1949. They choose to put Ashoka's wheel there on the flag, which is significant, right? That has to do with that's an important statement. Okay, so let's take a quick break, stretch your legs. I've got two more things for you to do today. Maybe, I don't know if we'll get through both of them, but we will get through one of them. But take a quick break, stretch your legs. I'll see you back here shortly, and then we'll talk about how Hinduism and Buddhism continue to develop through this period as they sort of move toward the modern age. Okay, so take a quick break, and I'll see you shortly, and we'll deal with that. Okay. Okay, good people, and we're back. So, with this period of development in India where we've talked about this the development of Buddhism and a little bit of Jainism and how Ashoka's empire sort of comes to be and how it's ruled um, is pretty interesting. It's very different from how empires and kingdoms have been ruled before, both in the Indian subcontinent and in other places in the world. And so, two of the things, or a few of the things I'd like to point out here that are important are one, the idea that Indians in this period are starting to think about a more secular approach to understanding the universe. Okay, and so think about um, think about maybe the ancient Egyptian idea of the way the world worked, where gods were responsible for all aspects of nature and some aspects of humanity as well, right? Whereas the Indians here in this period are starting to think about Dharma. They're starting to think about universal laws. They're starting to imagine that actually the world, the universe operates according to certain principles, and everyone has to follow them, even the gods, which is a different idea than the gods are in control of the universe, right? Now there's this higher order above the gods that the gods have to obey as well. And if you think about it, whether you believe in God or not, we kind of believe that in modern times here, right? We think that the world operates according to universal laws, right? Like gravity, for instance. And everybody has to obey gravity, right? You can't not obey that law. And so what's happening in India is kind of connected to what starts to happen now, where we start to imagine that the world and the universe operates according to principles, according to universal laws. And what's interesting is that that's happening in this period in India, but it's not the only place it's happening. There are other places in the world, almost in a similar time, where people are starting to think about the same things. They're starting to think about the idea of, yes, the gods still exist, but we start to believe that, or we're starting to believe that the world operates in a predictable way. And if we pay attention, we can figure out how that universe works. We can figure out what laws there are that govern the universe. And again, that's what's happening in India. That's kind of what the Buddha did when he meditated. He figured out a way in which he thought the world worked. And again, in other places of the world, and I'm thinking of ancient Greece here in Athens, Athenian philosophers are thinking the same thing. They're thinking, how can we look at the world around us and figure out how it works, figure out universal laws? So that's really interesting, and it's happening here in India, but it's also happening in other places of the world at this similar time. Another thing that we see is Ashoka presenting himself as a father of the nation. That won't be the last time we see that. Many leaders, even up to the modern world, will try to present themselves as the father of the nation, or a trusted uncle kind of thing. And interestingly, many authoritarian figures like to do that. And so I'm thinking of the Soviet Union, North Korea, Communist China, or not Communist China, but modern People's Republic of China today. Many leaders like to present themselves as that sort of father figure, right? That sort of authority figure looking after the children of the nation. And so Ashoka does that, but again, it won't be the last time that we see that either. Okay, that said, the last thing I'd like us to do is look at kind of how Hinduism and Buddhism develop and what we can learn about the roles of men and women in this society. Okay, so I have a little section of the text for you to read and a few questions for you to answer. And so I'm going to pop them into Microsoft Teams right now, and I'll also show you on the screen here as well. Not the Indian flag, but this. So, this section here that I'm going to ask you to read in the text is called Religious Transformations, Buddhism and Hinduism into the Common Era. So, it's just 4 pages from the textbook, and then a few questions about how Buddhism continues to develop, how Hinduism continues to develop, and what we learn about the role of men and women in Indian society in this particular time period. Okay, so I'm going to give you 20 minutes to read this and get your answers organized. Don't forget to type them, please and thank you. And I'll meet you back here at 11:25, and we'll talk about the answers and what you've read. Okay, so um, you can look at this. Also look in Microsoft Teams. The questions and the page numbers are there as well. Okay, so I'll see you back here at 11:25, and we'll talk about the answers to those questions. Okay. Okay, ready, shreddies? Okay. So I know there's a lot in that there's a lot in that section to look at and to deal with, but I think we can do it together, okay? So first question in this section is this one. So the textbook tells us a little bit about um, what happens to Buddhism after the death of the Buddha, and they say that it actually grows in popularity, actually spreads quite a bit. And so why why does it do that? Why does it become so popular? And so Cindy says it becomes a dominant public religion in this period after the Buddha's death. Yeah, that's true. Um, yeah, Buddhism has a bit of an advantage over Vedic Brahmanism in this period, right? Because um, in order to become sort of a in order to become like kind of included in religion and religious rituals, you have to be a Brahmin, right? And so if you're in a lower Varna, if you're in a Shudra, you have to sort of collect enough karma to eventually be born, to be reincarnated into the Brahmin Varna, into that level of society. And so it might take you quite a number of lives to accumulate enough good karma in order to work your way up there. But Buddhism is kind of a shortcut, right? Anyone can practice Buddhism, anyone can devote themselves to the eightfold path of the Buddha, and anyone can achieve enlightenment at any time, no matter what Varna they belong to, right? So there's kind of Buddhism has a benefit is that it's kind of a little more democratic in a way that it's open to anyone, right? And again, Christianity had that going for it as well, because Jesus argued that anyone can get into heaven, especially the poor and people who are kind of struggling. And so Buddhism is kind of similar in that it's a path that anyone can follow. You don't have to be at a certain level of society in order to follow that path, right? So Thika says Buddhism is more inclusive, and it pays little attention to birth and social class. Yeah, and in theory, anyone can become a Buddha, right? Yeah, anyone can achieve enlightenment. You don't have to be born into an upper Varna. Yeah, and it also had the support of people as well, right? So we have these little Buddhist monasteries popping up in India after the death of the Buddha, and people support these little monasteries. So kings send them money, merchants send them money, women will help them out, sending them money, bringing them food, and they do this, of course, because it contributes to their karma, right? If you have these people who are doing good and you support the people who are doing good, that helps you as well. And so even people who aren't necessarily Buddhist, they feel like it's a good idea for them to support these little Buddhist monasteries that are popping up. And so there's a lot of Buddhism is attractive for people to follow because anyone can become enlightened, but also helping these little monasteries becomes seen as a social good for people. And so people start to support these monasteries, and they grow. So yeah, it actually becomes a very in the years following the Buddha's death, it actually becomes a very popular religion in India. So the textbook explains, though, that in this period we have a few different versions of Buddhism appear, right? And this often happens with religions around the world, especially when the religion is started by one person. And so one person kind of appears, whether it's Jesus or Muhammad or whoever the kind of person who starts the religion, they're only alive for a short period of time, and so they kind of outline the basics of what the faith is. But then as time goes on, people feel the need to explain other things. Other questions appear that the original religious leader did not answer or did not think of. And so people start to elaborate, people start to find ways to explain things that the original religious leader didn't explain. And so sometimes you get differences of opinion in terms of how certain questions should be answered. And so we see that with Buddhism too. The Buddha is only around for, his lifetime. He spreads his teachings, but then after he dies, the faith continues to develop. And so Cindy says here there's Theravada Buddhism, right? Which is kind of more of the early form of Buddhism. It's the one that the Buddha taught, and so it's based on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And then there's Mahayana Buddhism, which appears a little bit later, right? And so Casey says, yeah, Theravada Buddhism was carried kind of south and west, so into Sri Lanka and into Southeast Asia, whereas Mahayana Buddhism spread into Central and East Asia. So we kind of have these two different variants spreading off in different directions, right? Mashid says, yeah, early Buddhism and based on the Four Noble Truths and the teaching of Buddha. Yeah, that's good. And Theravada Buddhism seeks to end suffering and attain nirvana by participating in the Eightfold Path. Mahayana Buddhism provides many paths to enlightenment for people from all walks of life. Yeah, so I'm no expert in either form of Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhism seems like a more elaborate form, and so there's different realms of existence. There are more people who can become the Buddha because they can be obtained, they can be enlightened. There are some people who could become enlightened but don't because they want to share their knowledge with other people. So again, these are people called bodhisattvas. So again, the basic teachings that the Buddha creates become elaborated on later, right? People ask more questions, they answer them in certain ways, and that creates different variants of the religion. And again, that's very common for religions to kind of split, right? As I say, as time goes on, people ask different questions. Sometimes they disagree on the answers to those questions, and you get different versions of the faith, evolving, right? Okay, I think this is the big one, isn't it? Yeah, so as Hinduism continues to develop, we see the creation of Dharma scriptures. And so what do we learn about the roles of men and women from these writings? Okay, this is a big one. This is a big one. There's lots to say here. All right. So Cindy says, so there's a couple things going on here, right? Is that we have roles for there are roles and responsibilities for men, and there are roles and responsibilities for women, but those also change over time, right? And so there are different stages of your life that you pass through, and your dharma, the sort of roles and responsibilities that you have, they kind of evolve through time. And so there's in terms of dharma, in terms of role and responsibilities, there's a gender difference, but there's also an age difference, right? People are expected to do different things at different times in their life, depending on whether they're a man or a woman, right? And so Cindy says here that initially a man must study and prepare for his occupation. So everyone is born into a varna and a caste, and so that will determine what your occupation will be, what your job will be. And so early on in your life, your job is to prepare for that, right? To study for it. Then as he becomes an adult, he is a householder, right? He is the head of the household. He raises a family. He does his job and contributes to society, right? He's a He's a sort of a good father, a good husband, a good man of the community. Um, and women at the same time are expected to be kind of helpers and supporters, right? So women help and support their father when they're young. Then when they become married, they help and support their husband. And so the text points out here that there becomes a pretty significant difference in terms of equality between men and women, right? Men have the power, men have the authority, men are the ones who are responsible for the house and responsible for earning a living, and women are kind of in a support role, right? They're sort of there to help out, but they don't have quite as much power or agency of their own, right? So that's all good. Casey says, yeah, a man must study so he's prepared for his occupation, and he must support his family and contribute to society. Yeah, that's his dharma, right? That's his duty. That's the way that that's his part in sort of the operation of the universe, right? And he's excuse me, and he's expected to fulfill that. And again, that's I can't speak to all of your cultures out there, but that's very at right angles to how sort of modern Western culture works, because we're not so much interested in role and responsibility. Here in the West, we're more interested in self-actualization, right? In following our bliss, in sort of becoming the person we want to be and doing the thing that we want to do. And so you can see there's a very different conception here. Kind of in modern Western society, we are all about doing what we want to do and figuring out what we want our lives to look like. And here we see a very different approach where you are sort of born into a role, into a varna and into a caste, and it is your duty to fulfill the responsibilities and the role of that caste. And so you don't quite have so much choice. Your job is to follow through on your responsibilities, right? Yeah, and that's what Dika says here, is that the Dharma scriptures defines those rules for everyone, and they have to follow those rules to lead a righteous religious life and to contribute to a good society. Yeah, it's good. And again, yeah, for women, they are expected to marry at a young age, and in some cases really young, yikes, and they serve their husband as a result, right? And Karen says here, yes, and men do have more social and political roles and more social and political power than women do. What else? Is there anything else to that? There was also something about men and old age, if I recall. Did anyone catch that? There was something about men were expected to learn their occupation, to learn their trade when they were young, and then kind of when they were middle age, they were expected to run their household and look after their family and contribute to their society, but then and dominate in public life. That's very true too, KC. But then when they're old, so you can imagine an older man where he's retired and his kids have grown up and they've moved out and they're running households of their own. What are these old guys expected to do? Did anyone catch that? These old dudes, are they supposed to retire to Florida or something? Let's see. I think if I remember, they were almost supposed to they were almost supposed to devote themselves to a religious kind of life, right? They were expected to sort of stay on the fringes of society, yeah, they should withdraw from society. They should kind of take themselves out of the way. Let younger people run their families and run their households. Maybe become monks or ascetics, and just kind of devote themselves to religious pursuits, right? And so again, it's a very different conception from the Western way of life, where it's very kind of selfish and individualistic. And here it's all about role and responsibility, right? You are born into your caste and into your varna. You learn your occupation. You do your occupation and contribute to your family and to society. And then when you've done those things, when you've retired from your occupation and when you have raised your family, you're supposed to kind of withdraw from public life and to sort of pursue religious matters, right? To devote yourself to praying to the gods or some such thing, right? So it's kind of a different idea than what we think of in the West. And again, I can't speak for all of your cultures out there, because there are a lot of cultures watching this live stream. But yeah, it's very different from the world I come from, anyway. Okay, and then last question. We're talking about Hinduism here, and they talk a little bit about some of the major gods in Hinduism. And of course, there are quite a few different gods, and some of those gods can have different expressions. And so the major gods can appear in different manifestations. They can appear in different ways. And so Dika says two of the most popular deities are Shiva and Vishnu. Shiva and Vishnu. And so who are these two characters, Shiva and Vishnu? What do they represent, or what are they the gods of? What are they the gods of? What are they the gods of? We have Shiva and Vishnu, and we can probably add... Yeah, but come on. Way too general. I don't have a motto, Sarvish, but if I did, it would be one-word answers are not answers. I need more. I need a sentence or something. So we have Shiva and we have Vishnu. What do these two characters do? Okay, so here we have Vishnu as the preserver of the universe. So Vishnu is kind of this God force that watches over the universe and preserves its order. Sometimes Vishnu can appear in different ways in order to preserve that balance of the universe. But yeah, he's one aspect of how the universe operates. But there's more. And so who's Shiva then? So Shiva is the destroyer, right? So Shiva is a creator and a destroyer, because in order to create, sometimes things need to be destroyed, right? And then we also have Brahma as a creator. And so you can see in these three gods, and of course there's many, many, many more, but in these three gods, we almost see this cyclical nature of the universe, right? Where Brahma is the creator, Shiva is the destroyer, and Vishnu sort of maintains the integrity of this universe and integrity of this cycle. And so the three, Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma, they all kind of work together to preserve the operation the universe, right? Okay. So, how are we? Are we good with that? Do you have any questions or things you want to add? Or things you want to subtract? You can't subtract anything. Things you want to add, questions you want to ask, or are you all good? Let me know. Are you okay? Are you good? Sheet is good. Karen is good. Cindy's good. Carmen is good. Thika's good. Casey is 2 thumbs up good. Jimmy's good. Sarvesh is good. Adalbert is good. Okay, so Pearly is good. So we've just kind of scratched the surface here of what India is. Luan is good. What India is and what India will become. I would love to spend more time on it, but unfortunately we can't. Aliana's good. Sabrina's good. So what we'll do tomorrow is we'll try to assimilate what we have learned here into some sort of general picture of what we've learned about India and how we can compare it to what we already know about Egypt and Mesopotamia before we head on to China. Lim is good. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time, so that's what we will do tomorrow. We'll tie up the loose ends on India. We may do some comparisons to Mesopotamia and to Egypt. And then if we have some time, we might move on to our next unit, which is China. So that said, I think I will leave you there. If you're in Vancouver, try and get outside today because it's beautiful. If you're not in Vancouver, still try to get outside because it's good for you. Yeah, that's it. So thank you for participating today. Thank you for being here. I had fun. And I guess we'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so bye.